Welcome to another deep dive here. This time, we're taking a look at something pretty special. The 2025 Honda CBR1000RR-R Fireblade SP. Now, we've got the brochure right here in front of us, and we're going to really try to break down what makes this bike so special. So if you're listening and you're wondering, like, what are the key things about this new Fireblade? What makes it different? What makes it better? That's what we're going to do today.
Yeah, that's right. You know, a brochure, it's always going to show off the best bits, isn't it? They want to get you excited. But we want to get into the real nitty-gritty, like the engineering and, is it all just hype?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, right off the bat, they're calling it the Superbike you've been waiting for, the pinnacle of street legal performance. And those are pretty big claims.
Yeah, pretty bold statements.
Yeah, pretty bold. But then they go on to say more power, especially in the critical mid-range. Now, for most people riding on the road, you spend a lot of time in that mid-range, don't you?
Yeah.
That's where you feel the bike.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the peak horsepower numbers, those are always the things that grab the headlines. But in reality, you're spending most of your time in that mid-range, aren't you? Accelerating out of corners, overtaking, that's where it really matters for everyday riding.
And it's not like they're just saying this with no evidence, are they?
Yeah.
They actually bring in Hayden Gillum, winning in MotoAmerica in the Stock 1000 class, and even going up against the factory Superbikes on the Fireblade. So that says something, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, MotoAmerica, that's a tough series, To be competitive there on a bike that's meant for the road as well, that says a lot about the fundamental design of the machine.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get under the skin a little bit. Let's talk engine. One of the first things they mention is a more responsive engine thanks to reduced crankshaft mass. Now, I know that sounds a bit technical, but why should we care about a lighter crankshaft?
Well, think of the crankshaft like the heart of the engine, right? It's spinning away in there, and if you make it lighter, it means there's less inertia for the engine to overcome when you open the throttle. So what that means for you is when you twist that grip, the engine responds quicker. It feels more eager, more alive.
It's more ready to go when you ask it to.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. They also talk a lot about the RC213 V-Spec bore and stroke, 81 millimeters by 48.5 millimeter. And they specifically mentioned it's the same as Honda's MotoGP bike. What does that tell us?
Well, it shows you just how serious they are about bringing MotoGP technology to the road. The bore and stroke, those are like the fundamental dimensions of the engine, right? And they directly affect how the engine breathes, how it makes power. And by using the same dimensions as the RC213V, they're basically saying, look, we're using all those lessons learned at the highest level of racing to make this engine as potent as possible.
Yeah, you can almost feel that MotoGP DNA in there. Now, they also mention a two-motor throttle-by-wire system. What's the advantage of having two motors controlling the throttle?
Well, it basically gives you a much finer degree of control over the engine. One motor can handle the main throttle opening, and the other one can make these tiny little adjustments to really fine-tune the power delivery. So it makes the throttle response smoother, it makes the power more predictable, especially when you're just rolling on and off the gas.
So it makes it easier to control, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Now let's talk exhaust. They've got this Akrapovič titanium muffler. And of course, titanium means lighter, which is always good. But it also has this special valve that helps boost torque at low revs and horsepower at high revs. So it's doing a lot of work there.
Yeah, it is. That valve is really clever. At low RPM, it closes off partially to create some back pressure, which helps with low down torque. That grunt you need when you're pulling away from a standstill or riding around town. But then when you open the throttle and the revs rise, the valve opens up fully to let the engine breathe and make maximum horsepower. So you get the best of both worlds.
It's like having two exhausts in one.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, they give us some standard engine specs as well. We got a 1,000cc liquid-cooled inline four-cylinder four-stroke, compression ratio of 13.6.1,
Right.
and DOHC 4 valves per cylinder. Anything stand out to you in those numbers?
Well, I mean, it's all pretty standard for a high-performance sport bike these days, but those numbers really do add up to a seriously potent engine. That high compression ratio means they're really squeezing a lot of power out of it, and the DOHC with 4 valves per cylinder, that's all about efficiency and performance right across the rev range.
Okay, so it's all pointing towards a very high-performing engine, and then they've got a little more technical detail. Programmed dual-stage fuel injection, PGM, DSFI,
Yeah.
52mm throttle bodies, Denzel 12-hole injectors. What's the takeaway for our listener there?
Well, it's just more evidence of how sophisticated the fuel system is. Dual stage injection, that means they're using 2 injectors per cylinder to really precisely meter the fuel at different engine speeds. Those large throttle bodies are like the engine's lungs, and they allow it to breathe deeply, which is what you need for high horsepower. And the 12-hole injectors, they just atomize the fuel really finely for better combustion.
So it's all about efficiency and performance, really.
Yeah, exactly. Getting the most out of every drop of fuel.
Now let's move on to the chassis. One of the things they really highlight is the swing arm derived from our RC213 VS. Now that's the road-going version of their MotoGP bike. That's a pretty exotic piece of kit. How significant is it that the Fireblade's swing arm is based on that?
Well, it's huge. The swing arm, that's a critical part of the chassis. It affects everything from traction to stability to the feedback you get from the rear wheel. And to have a swing arm that's based on the RC213 VS, which is a bike that was built with almost no compromises for performance, it shows you that they're really serious about handling.
So they brought that racing technology to the road.
Exactly.
Okay, now let's talk suspension. They've got this Öhlins second-generation Smart Eats suspension. And it's got an electronically controlled Öhlins NPX fork and a ProLinky single shock with electronically controlled Öhlins TTX36 SEC 3.6 damper. It's a mouthful, isn't it? But what does it mean for the rider? What's the advantage of having electronically controlled suspension?
Well, it means the suspension can adapt to what you're doing in real time. So whether you're riding on a smooth racetrack or a bumpy back road, the suspension is constantly adjusting the damping to give you the best possible grip and control.
So it's like having a personal suspension engineer riding with you.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, they specifically mentioned an improvement to the front fork. They've added a pressurized damping system that minimizes cavitation. Now, again, that sounds very technical, but can you break it down for us? What is cavitation and why is it bad?
Cavitation is basically when air bubbles form in the suspension fluid. It happens when the suspension is working really hard, like when you hit a bump. And those air bubbles, they can make the damping feel inconsistent and unpredictable because they compress differently than the fluid. So by pressurizing the system, they get rid of those air bubbles and the damping stays consistent and smooth.
So it makes for a better ride, basically.
Yeah, exactly. More controlled, more predictable.
Okay, they give us the suspension travel figures. 4.9-inch travel at the front and 5.6-inch travel at the rear. Are those numbers typical for this kind of sport bike?
Yeah, those are pretty standard figures for a modern sport bike. It gives you enough travel to soak up the bumps, but not so much that the bike feels wallowy or unstable when you're pushing hard.
Okay, so it's a good balance. Now let's move on to the technology. They highlight this 5-inch thin film transistor TFT instrument display. It sounds pretty high-tech, but what does it actually offer the rider?
Well, a TFT display is basically like having a smartphone screen on your bike. It's full color, it's high resolution, it's really easy to read in all lighting conditions, and it can display a huge amount of information.
Yeah, and they list a whole bunch of stuff that it can show. Engine temperature, riding modes, speedometer and tachometer, shifter setting, ABS level, gear position, remaining fuel, and more. So you've got pretty much everything you need right there in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all there at a glance. No need to take your eyes off the road.
Okay, now let's talk about stopping power. The Fireblade SP has got dual 330mm discs with radial mount, a 4-piston Brembo Stylema R calipers up front, and a single 220mm disc with Brembo caliper at the rear. That sounds pretty serious.
Yeah, those Brembo Stylema R calipers, they're some of the best you can get. They offer incredible stopping power with loads of feel, and the radial mounting that just makes the whole system stiffer and more responsive, so when you grab a handful of brake, you know it's going to stop.
Okay, what about tires? They list a 2070 ZR17 radial at the front and a 2005 ZR17 radial at the rear. Are those standard sizes for a bike like this?
Yeah, those are pretty typical sizes for a leader class sport bike. That big rear tire gives you plenty of grip for acceleration and cornering, and the ZR rating means they're designed for very high speeds.
So you're well covered there. They also give us some key geometry figures. The rake is 24.0 degrees, the trail is 4.0 inches, and the wheelbase is 57.2 inches. How do those numbers affect the handling?
Well, those figures suggest a bike that's both agile and stable. You know, the relatively steep rake and short trail mean it should turn in quickly and easily, but that fairly long wheelbase helps to keep it stable at higher speeds.
Okay, so it sounds like a good balance again. They list the seat height as 32.7 inches. Is that considered high or low for a sport bike?
It's pretty average for a sport bike. It's designed to give you good ground clearance in the corners and put you in a sporty riding position.
I know we've got a fuel capacity of 4.4 gallons. Is that enough for a bike like this?
Yeah, that's pretty standard for a sport bike. It's enough for a good day's riding without having to constantly stop for fuel.
Okay. A couple of other specs they mentioned are the 6-speed transmission and the hashtag 525 chain 16T44T final drive. Anything noteworthy there?
Not really. I mean, 6 speeds, that's pretty standard for a sport bike. And the chain final drive is the most common type. It's efficient and it's lightweight.
Okay, so it's all pretty standard stuff there. And finally, they mentioned the Grand Prix red color option.
Yeah, classic Honda racing colors. It looks great.
It does, yeah. And of course, they include the very important safety disclaimer. Always wear a helmet, eye protection, and protective clothing. Never ride after consuming drugs or alcohol, and never use the street as a racetrack.
Absolutely. Always good advice.
Yeah, very important. They also mentioned the trademarks for CBR and ProLinky. So there you have it, the 2025 Honda CBR1000RR-R Fireblade SP. It sounds like a pretty incredible machine.
Yeah, it does. It's clear that they've taken everything they've learned from MotoGP and poured it into this bike.
Yeah, and they haven't just focused on peak performance. They've really thought about the rider and how to make the bike as usable and enjoyable as possible.
Absolutely. It's all about the riding experience.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it leaves us with an interesting question. How far can you push racing technology on a road bike?
Yeah.
Is there a point where it becomes too much? Is the Fireblade SP maybe pushing that boundary?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it the perfect blend of track performance and road usability?
Yeah.
I think that's something for all of us to consider.
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. I mean, technology is always evolving, and who knows what the future holds.
Exactly. All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.